Okay, so where we left the video off is we have a broad-based revolution. We have the return of Khomeini, who's the leader of those that want to found an Islamic State. And within the cities, we have revolutionary youth. We have junior officers and military who are kind of abandoning the Shah in favor of the revolution. And we have this great hostility towards the United States as the Shah flees, and as he flees, like past allies of the United States, he takes with him considerable assets that the country looks at as owned by the country and not by the person, the leader, the Shah. And the Shah is seeking treatment at the United States Mayo Clinic in Minneapolis, and so there's this threat looming over U.S.-Iranian revolutions as U.S.-Iranian relations as it enters this new era. And that is that should the United States stand by its ally, it will lose the country as an ally in the region. But this is a great deal of pressure on the United States and the Carter administration. Because to abandon an ally like the Shah, who's been seen as a stalwart and seen as carrying such a load for the United States in a region where they have few allies outside of Saudi Arabia and Israel at this time, would set a signal to a lot of their other allies, potentially a very negative signal. But the decision to stand by the Shah ultimately fires back on U.S. embassy workers as it's stormed and sieged by this Iranian youth who are being encouraged by Khomeini. And so we get this standoff, this hostage taking that's only resolved in the 11th hour by the Carter administration as it's outgoing and about to hand over the White House to President Ronald Reagan, wherein the United States agrees to release some assets that it's frozen in American banks that were possessed by Iran back in return for the hostages. And this sets in place an important precedent that we were going to have even with Iran under Khomeini, and Iran as a hostile Islamic state that opposes the U.S. and its interests in the region, is that the common ground that the U.S. usually finds with Tehran is to relinquish assets, money, in exchange for hostages. And this is something that Iran has continued to do through its agents like Hezbollah and other countries like Jordan and Lebanon throughout the region, is exchange American hostages or Western hostages in return for money or in return for the reduction of sanctions or some kind of greater access to the wider Western world. And so that's a pattern that we've seen established from that moment with the siege of the embassy that continues to be a point of negotiations between the U.S. and Tehran to the current day. Now, as I mentioned, that revolution is also being winnowed down. The Islamic clerics under Khomeini, who want to found a republic based on a completely religious-based rule of law, and a religious basis for politics, and a religious basis for the Constitution, and a religious basis for education, and a religious base for foreign policy, they're starting to remove or silence their own critics very quickly. And so we have this really bloody, chaotic period of the revolution from 1979 to 1981, where we see the Republic of Iran established as an Islamic-based society. Okay? So we see the repeal of the secular constitution. Instead, sovereignty, control over affairs is transferred from the Shah, this ruling house, to the clergy, and from secular kind of Western-based law codes that were first devised under French systems and then later the United States to Islamic Sharia law as the basis for commerce, as the basis for constitutional rights, as the basis for the relationship between men and women. There's a lot of bloody strife, so there's a lot of infighting, and this revolutionary terror is going to leave about 10,000 dead. And those then that have been opposed to an Islamic Republic, we're seeing quite a bit of them travel out. Ironically enough, quite a few of which will end up in the United States. About 500,000 end up in exile living in other countries, and tens of thousands end up making their way to the United States. And with them, particularly you see a lot of technological expertise leave the country. A lot of engineers, a lot of scientists at this point leave in exile. The reforms do, however, set up a much stronger state than we saw under the Shah, and reforms even that create a more equal basis for society than we'd seen under the Shah. Under the Shah, really, oil and other industries that are doing success internationally are really just enriching a few families or a few companies. And I mentioned the problems with agriculture. Here, the Islamic Republic redistributes land, it broadens healthcare, it broadens educational opportunities for the poor, and to the surprise of most students that take this class, you actually see a sudden surge of women become more active in public life. They increase their enrollment in the university and the civil service, so arms of the government. You do also see a repressive society, though, that doesn't allow for dissent from Islamic rule or an Islamic basis for society. We have strict censorship of the press, public discourse, and there's kind of a lack of what we consider to be secular or religious freedoms. Okay. In terms of foreign policy, then, it becomes the center for all these Shiite minorities that live in neighboring countries. And also, it becomes a beacon of opposition to the United States, a beacon of opposition to the West, but also a beacon of an alternative to either communism or capitalism. The Soviet Union doesn't welcome Iran's evolution into a strong country at this time as well, because the Shah is equally critical of communism as some kind of Western perverse ideology that would be ruinous for Iran as well. Almost immediately after founding the Republic, you see an attack, a war launched by Iran's neighbor and longtime rival, Iraq, in part because Iraq looks at this as a prime time to take over the movement of oil across a region where you see the conflation of rivers here, the Shatt al-Arab. And they think that this can happen because the revolution has ended with the loss of so many high-ranking officials in the military, and especially pilots, that they feel like that this new revolutionary country just can't possibly defend itself. So they're going to seize oil, and Iraq is going to position itself as the leader of the Arab world in the wake of Egypt kind of falling off, right? It does not end up being a short victory, as Iraq and Saddam Hussein had planned. Instead, it bogs down into a very, very long, deadly conflict. And what makes it so deadly is so many arms dealers profit from this war, from countries like the United States, from the Soviets, from Europe, and especially from Israel. We have this quote down here at the bottom of the slide from Israel's defense minister, Yitzhak Rabin, where he says, "We don't want a resolution of this war." And what he's saying there is, here we have Shiites and we have Sunnis, or we have Shiites and Arabs fighting each other. We have this conflict within the Middle East. So let's exploit that. It's a conflict of groups that are neither communists or capitalists, right? And so, groups that are both opposed to Israel and its survival in the region. And so they want to continue this conflict to go on endlessly, so that as much blood is shed, and so that both powers end up weakened. One side winning is bad. It elevates their position, their power, and their influence across the region. So instead, you want this to carry on. And so we see the conflict go on from 1982 to 1989. Over 40 different countries sold weapons, and many to both sides. And that's really the point. Now, some of the legacy then is this will create great hostility in both Iraq and Iran to the international community, which in part explains why Iran continues as a rogue state in the 1990s and even to the present day to some extent, with few allies, is because it is a Shiite country, is because it's in its Islamic basis for a government, and because of its sense that the international community didn't want it to survive, and that actually profited from its suffering, from a prolonged war with its neighbors, that included chemical weapons and poisonous gas, the first of which being used since the First World War had made that an illegal act of war. Okay. So we're going to talk more about this on Friday when we get into the conversations. But that war in particular helps explain Iran's role in the region today. It still aspires to be a regional leader. It hopes to continue to promote its security in part by weakening those around it, like Iraq, but also in sustaining the Assad regime in Syria, in part because Syria, being another country with a sect of Shiites at the top, Assad's family are Alawite Muslims, had actually was the only country in the region to support Iran during this war, to actually take a side with it in its war against Iraq, in its war for survival in the 1980s. And so it looks at itself as indebted to Syria, to Assad, and to his father, who had helped them fight for their survival and sustain themselves. And that's in part why they refuse to let that regime fall, either to U.S. opposition or in 2014 and 2015 when it was threatened by ISIS. ISIS being dominated by Sunni Muslims, too. So that Sunni Shiite conflict in part explains why Iran supports Syria, why it has sent many of its Islamic Revolutionary Guard. Pictured here in the top, kind of dusty beard here, is Major Qasem Soleimani, who helped orchestrate its defense in Syria against rebels, primarily ones calling for greater democratic freedom or freedom from oppression from Assad, but groups that were either Kurds or groups that were Sunni Muslims, and if power, could help to isolate Iran in the region even more, make it so that it's completely surrounded by Sunni Muslims and people of the Muslim faith that it feels like it has a historical conflict with and competes with power. So Khomeini has used the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to help fight the war in Syria to sustain Assad's regime against the rebels, the Kurds, and the Sunnis, and against when it was threatened by the Islamic State, or ISIS, or ISIL, also which are Sunni Muslims who committed many atrocities against Shiites when they had conquered large portions of Iraq. Khomeini also was integral in recruiting Putin and going to Russia and getting them to join the conflict in order to help supply air support, and also to draw on Shiite populations scattered throughout numerous countries around the world, in part by offering them stipends to come fight. So actually, Iran, in order to sustain Syria, has gone off into countries like Afghanistan and Pakistan and found Shiites there, helped form them into militias, train them, and help bring them into Syria or in Iraq to fight against both ISIS and the rebels fighting against Assad. Okay, so we'll go over a lot of this on Friday because we're running out of time here again, and I don't want you to have to watch 3 videos. But we're looking at Islamic republics, okay, as an alternative to a U.S. democratic-style capitalism and towards a Soviet centrally planned economy that's communist, okay? And the key question that we're looking for in reading those 3 chapters is, like, in what sense does Islam promise to give people equality, to give them justice, to give them prosperity? Because those are all things that we expect a modern government to do, to deliver equality, to deliver justice through its legal system, and to deliver prosperity by managing the economy. And those are all things that Islam, as Khomeini styles it in the Little Green Book, promises to give to people of Iran, too. The second question here in the conclusion is the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime. Did the indifference of the international community to the Iran-Iraq war normalize the use of chemical weapons? And by that we mean the idea that the international community by and large profited by selling weapons to both sides, including weapons that were illegal in conventional warfare to both sides. And really there was no sustained effort to stop or negotiate or bring this war to a peaceful resolution. Instead, people like Israel's prime minister instead preferred that it would just keep going on and that blood would continue to be shed. Has that made countries like Iran indifferent to calls that things like nuclear weapons must not be proliferated, or that chemical weapons by the Assad regime must not be used against people? Okay? That's kind of a cloudy question. We'll get back into that. And then the last thing to remember is that Islam, like communism and like American-style democracy, looked at itself in the 1970s and 1980s as something that should spread beyond its own borders, that other countries should take up. And so Iran, from its foundation, which was rather humble, aspires to be a leader in this region as a protector of the Shiite, people that are scattered across the Muslim world and around the globe today, as the true legitimate heirs, as defenders of the Islamic faith versus Sunnis, but also over Sunnis in that sense, in terms of a hierarchy. And this is in part why it has been so interventionist in the fates of its neighbors, like Iraq and Syria, and why it continues to wage a struggle against Israel today. All right. We'll talk more on Friday.